All right, first thing is, this is the kind of stuff that people will read. And I want you guys to be able to handle contemporary stuff that comes down the pike. You got to be able to handle this kind of stuff. Like a few years back when Rick Warren's Purpose-Driven Life was, making all the rounds. Everybody was all jumping on this thing. And you got to be able to do this. And the way to handle it is not with a knee-jerk, oh, not CPH, don't look at it. This is not the way to handle it. Neither is the way to handle it. It's just kind of say, well, there's some decision theology, dismiss it. You need to be able to say what's going on here and read stuff and read it critically and be aware. So that's one reason. All right, so this is actually popular literature. It's out there. That's one reason. What else? Why did I have you read it?
In certain sections, it was very apparent that he was doing his Christology from below.
All right. I would agree. He is an example of someone doing Christology from below. What's going on? What's happening here? So that's part of this. I agree. Okay, good. Anything else? Yes. You.
This is in Korea. The pastor do not teach the Christian doctrine based on the Bible. So because some pastor enthusiasm, enthusiasm. It's in the Reformation age.
Oh yeah. The Pentecostal kind of.
Yeah, Pentecostal. Yeah, but the systematic theologian, some systematic theologian, usually wrote the book kind of very difficult to systematic books.
Yes.
So some church members do not understand what kind of books has written, but I had a good impression. This book is quite easy to explain the Christian doctrine. That means it's quite relevant in modern today for the Christian people. So that's why it's quite impressive.
All right, good. So it's not kind of ethereal and difficult to grasp. All right, agreed. Good. Yes. So he gives you a good example of making theology accessible. I would agree.
Yeah, I agree. Just comparing this to Pieper, oh my goodness, it's just to me, it's way easier to understand than Pieper.
Well, it's like you're comparing apples and anvils.
Yeah, exactly. But just like you said, for giving it to parishioners or people who want to know more, and they aren't very deep yet or haven't dug very deep yet, I think it's a lot more useful.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I wouldn't even compare. Don't compare them to Pieper. They're doing two different things. But yeah. Okay. All right. Now, those are part of the reasons. I want you to be able to learn to read critically, and not to read just with kind of a knee-jerk negative reaction, and see some positive. First time I read through this, I was intrigued. Metaxas is kind of, he's a new name, so I picked the book up and cranked through it. And I thought, that's pretty fun. And let's see where can I squeeze that into my curriculum. And so I just found a spot and shoved it in there, and because I wanted you guys to encounter this, because I want you guys to be aware of things. I want you guys to encounter stuff. I want you to know things that are out there. Have we talked in here about apologetics yet at all? A little bit. This is another example of this, kind of the whole apologetics. That's what's going on here. This is one of those things where if you got a non-Christian, you hand this to him, well, it might make an impact, it might not. But for your Christian people, this could be really helpful. Like, wow, I hadn't thought of it that way, or wow, that's really engaging. And they realize that, hey, you can think and you can use your brain, and you don't have to check your brain at the door when you come to church. And we have way too many people living their lives that way, with their idea that, this is our people in our churches, where in church I do spiritual stuff and I do my faith thing, and that's where I kick into my faith mode. But then when I leave the church, I click back into realistic mode, and now I'm basing things on empirical knowledge and on science and this kind of stuff, and I can turn my brain back on now because I'm leaving the faith atmosphere. And we have people in our churches who operate this way. And they think it's very pious. Yes, I have a faith. That's my faith part of my life. But then my real life, there's other things. And when a guy like this comes along and he's actually thinking across the board, that's kind of engaging. And they realize, maybe I can actually think here in church. And maybe I can actually take some of my faith ideas and my ideas about God and let them apply into my life out here. And that's connections we need to be making with people a lot more. We need to encourage them to be living all their lives in the context of Christ's revelation, because they're not. They used to. They used to take this for granted. But people nowadays increasingly are not doing that. They have a Weltanschauung, the worldview, which is very much practical and pragmatic most of their life. Then they have their God part carved out, and they kind of subdivide them. And they're doing that. And we can't let them get away with that, because that makes their faith basically futile and not even a real faith eventually. So this is a concern. So Metaxas helps with that. All right. Now, the other thing that's just kind of background here a little bit, I don't want to miss this, is I want to talk just a little bit about this word, So I don't think I've talked about that in here yet. Rhetoric, okay? When you hear the word rhetoric, what do you think of? Speech? Structured argument? Fancy, long-winded attempts, boring, political stuff. The word rhetoric has taken on, and you guys are all relevant in your answers, but the word rhetoric has taken on in our contemporary culture a decidedly negative tone. We use the word with negative overtones, negative connotations, when we want to suggest that somebody's not being quite straight with the facts, or that they're twisting things or spinning things. And so you'll hear stuff like, hey, spare me the political rhetoric. Or you're getting a lot of rhetoric coming out of the Republican camp these days, whatever. And so the rhetoric just basically means it's twisted or manipulative or not quite truthful. And so people are kind of suspicious of this. But we have to remember, rhetoric was the top of the education system in the medieval world and through the Reformation and through the Renaissance time. You had the whole basic, you learn math and science and the foundational kinds of things, and then you'd work your way up through, the logic and other parts of the educational system. Well, the top rung was rhetoric, because rhetoric is the power, the skill, the ability of persuasion. That's what rhetoric is. So once you've learned something, how do you persuade other people of your position? That's rhetoric. And rhetoric is not negative. Rhetoric is just the ability, the skill to be persuasive. When you guys get in the pulpit, you better be using rhetoric. You're going to be. And the best sermons you've ever heard are sermons that are rhetorically powerful. Think about it. Whatever they use. And often and there's all kinds of things that come into rhetoric. Catchphrases, repetitious stuff, poetic aspects, the kinds of things that make the argument powerful. And so there are lots of examples of good rhetoric. Now, what's also interesting, and just kind of a sidelight before I get too far here, start talking about metaxis, is to think back even to our own heritage. Philip Melanchthon, okay, Luther's right-hand man, the great theologian, was never ordained, did not teach in the Department of Theology at the University of Wittenberg. He was not in the Department of Theology. He wrote our confessions, but he wasn't a theologian. He taught in the Department of Philosophy. And what was his forte? Aristotle and rhetoric. In fact, what's that? Yes. In fact, he wrote the book on rhetoric literally. And he wrote a book on rhetoric that was used throughout European schools for about 200 years by Protestants and Catholics. Catholics had praise for it because it was the definitive textbook on rhetoric. Melanchthon, our guy, Philip, the dude. So he was a rhetoric guy. He knew this stuff well, and his influence was profound. His students learned from him. So you get Chemnitz, and you get Musculus, and all these guys who were taught by Melanchthon using his skill, and you can see it. When we get to Two Natures of Christ here after Christmas, and you guys start cranking into Chemnitz, well, there's a contrast for you. We're going to go from Metaxas to Chemnitz, with Bauckham in between. When you get to Chemnitz, I'll let you make your own conclusions, but you're going to see rhetoric like crazy. Very different than metaxas, but there's the same thing going on. It's the power of persuasion. Rhetoric is good. When I teach, I'm trying to use rhetoric. Do it all the time. Some of it's conscious, some of it's not. But I'm trying to do it because I want to be persuasive. I want you to hear what I'm saying. I want you to believe it. And I want you to change your patterns. I want you to conform to what I'm telling you. That's the goal of rhetoric. Is that my goal when I teach? Yes. I'm not here just dumping data. I want to shape you. That's my goal. I'm very overt about it. All right? And that should be your goal in the pulpit, right? Because if you don't want the people to conform to what you're saying, then don't bother. Sit down. If you're just there to spill time or to share some thoughts, sit down. You are there to proclaim the Word of God. That's to be normative. It's to be life-shaping. Rhetoric is absolutely appropriate. All right? So, is Metaxas using rhetoric? Like crazy. Like crazy. Some kind of unusual forms. One of his most skillful choices of rhetoric, Sarah's comment notwithstanding, is humor. Is that a rhetorically powerful thing? Yes. Because it has this way of kind of getting the listener kind of in with you, he's sympathetic to you, and it kind of relaxes you a little bit. You're kind of laughing with him. And then he brings in a point, it's like, you're more receptive. Your defenses are down a little bit. You're ready to listen. Humor's that way. Humor is really powerful. And you even think about some of the comedies that people are watching, you know, the influence of comedians, you know, people developing their opinions and shaping their opinions. Ask Sarah Palin about how effective it is. Okay? You know, these are powerful things because comedy, people kind of, they laugh and stuff, but then they believe things, and things get interjected into stuff. It's powerful. It's a powerful tool. And there are other things metaxas will use. I mean, just even the Q&A format, really effective. So here's a question. Oh, here's an answer. And then you tend to anticipate, what's the next question? Here's the next question. And even the kind of tete-a-tete between them, you know, not always, you know, getting along. This is effective. It engages you. There's another thing that Metaxas does, which is kind of weird. You guys, could you follow any order to his chapters? Nobody brought that up. More or less. He's kind of following the life of Christ, walking through. But the chapters kind of are weird, the way they're thrown together, to be honest. I mean, he goes from one thing to another thing. He talks about Christ's death, and you're thinking resurrection's next, but no, he defers that for a while, and he goes to some other things. And he's kind of all over the place. And he ends things kind of weird. And so there's this kind of a... what's that?
Is it like almost like like another chapter at the end?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's like a kind of a hanging chapter, another thing, kind of just you're waiting for more. And so there's this random aspect to it, which actually I think is also another rhetorical move. It's not by accident. It's not like Metaxas when he's kind of just doing it off the top of his head. I don't think so. This is crafted. He knows what he's doing, and it's that kind of randomness that actually kind of reflects conversation. And it pulls you in. It's like that's how conversations go, and you just kind of wander around. And there's also this sense of kind of, I'm going to hit a topic, and then I'm going to pound on it a little bit, then I'm going to go to something else. Then I'll come back and on to that again. And it is effective. It can work. There's these things going on here. So you need to recognize this. Let me give you another concrete example from history. Gospel of Mark. Mark is often understood to be, well, he's the earliest gospel, very simplistic. You know, Mark, you know, he kind of just rearranges things. You know, Mark, euthus, immediately, you know, everything's always immediately with Mark, and just bang, 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 and doesn't spend too much time telling about things. That's Mark. And we get this kind of idea of simplistic. But when you start to actually study Mark, you are blown away by how carefully crafted it is. Mark has the classic literary sandwich where he takes introduces a topic and then goes to another thing, then goes back to that topic, and they kind of contrast each other. Where you've got the plot to destroy Jesus, you got Mary's anointing with oil, and then Judas agreeing to betray Jesus. Wow, pretty cool. The contrast there is great. You got the cursing of the fig tree, and then the temple cleansing in between. All right, this is Mark. Mark, and then you got the kick-all of all with Mark, which is the ending of Mark. You know, well, he obviously, and we read Lenski, he obviously didn't intend to end with verse 8. Something's missing. Either he didn't finish it or got lost or something's wrong. And so everybody starts coming up with their theories. Well, which ending do you like? Long ending, short ending? Is it Markan or not? What's going on? And most scholars will say, none of that's Markan. That's my opinion. And you say, well, then what happened? Well, finally I read somebody who makes sense of it all. And this is not my idea, but I love the answer. And he says, no, Mark ended exactly where he wanted to. Verse 8 is the end of Mark. And that's how Mark wrote it. And you say, what? How could he end like that? And the women were afraid. Because it fits his purposes exactly. Because in Mark's gospel, how do the apostles appear consistently? Always about 3 steps behind. Always. They're struggling, they're missing stuff, and they're always kind of off whack. They can't keep up with Jesus. They don't know what's going on. They're kind of bumbling. They're kind of messing stuff up. And then the last time the disciples appear in the Gospel of Mark is chapter 14, verse 50. I'm teaching Mark. That's why I know this stuff. So chapter 14, verse 50. And the last time the apostles appear in the Gospel of Mark is in Garden of Gethsemane, and they all fled. Never hear about them again. We're done. Except for Peter's denial. We get that. We get that. And that's it. No disciples at the cross, no John and Mary stuff, none of that. No disciples in the upper room, none of that. No disciples, nothing. We get Jesus telling the women, go and tell my disciples and Peter, so we get that, which is a nice, hopeful thing, but that's it. And so this author that I read said, this fits Mark's purpose perfectly, because Mark is writing to people he wants to persuade to become followers of Christ. First verse, this is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. Mark's pow, right there. This is it. So what's his purpose? I want you to be a follower of Christ. So you're reading Mark's gospel and thinking, you're reading all about what Jesus is doing, and you're coming to the conclusion, as Peter does in Mark 8, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And yes, well, now what are you going to do with that information? What happens? All of Jesus' disciples turn and run. Well, who's going to go tell the story about the empty tomb? Who's going to proclaim that he's not there, he's risen? Who's going to do this? And what's the obvious answer supposed to be? I've got to. Bing, ding, 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 ding. Exactly. This is Mark's purpose. And so when you read it that way, you think, wow, Mark, you're a genius. Wow, that is so cool. Because when you read Mark's gospel, that's exactly the effect it has on you. It's incredible. So is Mark a slouch, kind of a slough? No, it's carefully crafted. Now, when we do Balcom next week, I can't wait, I love doing Balcom. When we do Balcom next week, and we see what he does with the Gospel of John, and what's going on in Paul, it's like, oh, man. It gives you a whole new appreciation for rhetoric and the power of persuasion and the way we use our words and things that are going on here. And we should not dismiss that. It's a huge thing. And Metaxas gives you a good example of it. All right. Other comments or anything else here? Yep.
I think also along the line of rhetoric, it seems like it takes Q a long time to get the answer.
Okay.
And so you're almost like, come on, Q,
Come on, get with it, buddy. Yeah.
And so I think that brings us along with it too.
Yeah, it does. It does. Because Q gives him a chance to ask the questions and kind of take him along. And if he wants to say something else, he lets Q be stupid for another question or two. You're exactly right. It's part of that rhetoric. Yep.
Yeah, I was thinking about kind of the same thing when I was reading it. I was like, it depends on the reader, definitely. But I was thinking, who am I supposed to relate to? Like Q or A or the author. It was really interesting. And I was thinking, like I said, it depends on who's reading it. If it's someone who doesn't know much about Christianity, maybe they would relate to Q. And I don't think we're supposed to relate to Q.
All right.
As people, students at the seminary, I thought it was
No,
really
I
interesting.
hope not.
Yeah, exactly. I thought it was really interesting. Who do you relate to, or where do you come in on this book?
Yeah, agreed. And he brought up Pink Floyd in a positive way. It's remarkable. In one of the best albums, maybe. Well, Animals is right up there, along with Wish You Could Be Here, but anyway. We'll see. Now you know something about me. All right. Page 97, chapter 11. This is why I chose this book. We're at this, we think about where we are. We've been doing Stein, Christology from below. And we got Jesus up to the triumphal entry, and then I stopped with Stein. Now, at this stage, I could have gone with 3 sources, because I've used all 3 at some different points. I could have just saw Stein through to the bitter end. And if you want to do that sometime, read Stein all the way through, and you'll see what I mean. Stein covers lots of material, covers it very effectively, but he gets kind of preachy, and it loses a little bit of some of the freshness. But maybe that's just because I've spent so much time thinking about the Holy Week and Passion Week that it doesn't seem as fresh to me. Maybe that's my problem. But Stein can do it. So Stein's one possibility. Another possibility, which is one of them I referenced in the recommended books, is the book by Paul Meyer. Paul Meyer, as in prophet, Western Michigan University, the LCMS guy who wrote, Pontius Pilate and those kinds of books, Skeleton in God's Closet, that Paul Meyer. Board of Regents, that Paul Meyer. He wrote books a long time ago called First Christmas, First Christians, and First Easter. First Easter, First Christians. And now they've been brought together in one volume called In the Fullness of Time. He does a nice job in that book of walking through a lot of the facts and the stories and the different things, the same kinds of stuff that Metaxas gets into in this chapter, Meyer covers very well. And I've used his book before in this class. And then I read Metaxas and thought, oh man, he's covering the same material, not as scholarly, but this would be a good departure for the students to wrestle with Metaxas and get into this. So the real reason I chose this book was primarily just for this one chapter. But heck, you may as well read the whole thing, right? Otherwise you just wouldn't appreciate it. So that's what we're doing. So this chapter is what I really wanted to get into, because what we're talking about now and what I want to zero in on is the last week of Christ's life. And we're going to kind of do it in reverse. So we're going to start with the stuff Metaxas is getting into about the cross and the crucifixion and what's going on with the cross and the Easter thing, and then we're going to back it up and hit a couple other highlights I want to make sure I cover before we run out of time today on just some of the from below factual stuff about Christ and his life. So that's what we're going to do. All right. So in this chapter, what's Metaxas dealing with?
Is he a lunatic, a liar,
All right. Yeah, he's just basically channeling C.S. Lewis here. And the famous quote from C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, if you haven't read that, you need to do that sometime. Put it on your to-do list, Christmas break, next summer, whatever, when you've got free time. Yeah. So anyway, Lewis famously said in one of his great passages in Mere Christianity that Jesus Christ is either liar, lunatic, or Lord. And Metaxas quotes Lewis, gives him credit, but he's basically kind of elaborating on this, all right? You know, what are you going to do with Jesus? How are you going to play this out? Now, further than in this chapter, what does Metaxas get into, especially? He's getting into what's going on the cross and how we're going to understand Calvary and what's actually happening here. So we have in here basically the theories of Calvary and what's going on. So, and that's where the chapter comes in. The chapter swiped, swooned, or sprung, okay? And so what are well, we'll get into some of the theories in a minute here. First of all, let's establish something. Was the tomb empty Sunday morning? Absolutely. And this is basically historical fact. This is one of the arguments that Meyer makes really well, and Stein makes a little bit, and Metaxas mentions, but there's no doubt the tomb was empty on Sunday morning. No doubt. Now, how can we say that so definitively?
Because the Romans would.
Yeah, I mean, there are just so many reasons why you can make this case. The tomb was absolutely empty on Sunday morning. So then we have to figure out how we're going to account for that. How do we account for the fact that the tomb was empty? Because the report went out, hey, he's not there. So now we got to come up with an answer. Why not? Why isn't he there? And so now what you encounter then is people trying to come up with reasons or explanations why the tomb was empty. And now we start work our way through the list. Metaxas covers many of them. There are others. Meyer covers just about everyone that's ever been thought of, in rather summary fashion, but pretty quickly. He just bangs through them real quickly. But some of the reasons that are given. So one of the reasons is the wrong tomb idea. So the wrong tomb theory is that the women, early Sunday morning, it was still kind of dark and they couldn't see real well, and Friday had been late and they weren't paying a lot of attention. So Sunday morning when they went to the tomb, they got a little turned around in the garden and they went to the wrong tomb. And they thought it was the right tomb, but actually it was just a vacant tomb, and they went, looked in the tomb, and it was empty. So they started telling everybody, look, he's alive, empty tomb, empty tomb. So that's the first possibility. They went to the wrong tomb. All right? So why doesn't that explanation work?
It's too easy to go to the right tomb and say, here he is.
Yeah, I mean, if they were at the wrong tomb, all the Sanhedrin has to do is say, over here. The one with the Roman guards and the seal, that's the right one. Another one has the idea that they moved Jesus. And the idea here is they call this the lettuce theory because supposedly the gardener had planted some lettuce and he was tired of people traipsing through his garden plot trying to get to Jesus' tomb, so he actually moved the body to a different tomb. And it's just really the same thing again. So, and the explanation is, as soon as the disciples started telling people, hey, Jesus is alive, all you got to do is say, no, he's not. You got in the wrong place. Okay? And see, that's also the whole idea here, the wrong tomb and the move Jesus. Because if you're going to start saying, hey, he's alive because the tomb's empty, then all you got to do is point to the right place and that's gone. All right, next theory we get here, the more significant one, is the idea of the stolen body. So the stolen body theory. And how's this one go? Well, you got a couple options. One is you could have the enemies of Jesus stole his body, and then the other one would be the disciples stole his body. All right, so if we're going to advance the idea that the enemies of Jesus stole his body, what's wrong with that idea? Why would you actually feed the claims of his resurrection? And if you had stolen his body, then all you have to do is produce his body when the claims come and say, here's your Messiah. And everything's settled. It's just like kind of pointing to Gaddafi's body. There's your evil dictator. So what? Not a big deal anymore. So that isn't holding water. All right, so how about the most popular one? The disciples stole the body and fabricated the story. Yep.
It's the more people you have, the harder it is to keep a secret.
All right, this is going to be the last of the arguments we'll get to. We'll come to that one. You're exactly right. Sarah?
They're all willing to die for their faith, and most of them did.
Yeah, their case is similar too. I mean, we'll hit this one first. You guys are talking about this. This is a significant argument. So if we're going to try to come up with a conspiracy, and we're all in on it, to keep the lid on a conspiracy that long and everybody to agree on that, that's a pretty big feat. That doesn't happen. And then the other thing is, if you know it's a lie, you don't die for a lie that you know. And yet the disciples, all with the exception of John, all die by tradition as martyrs for the faith. they're willing to give their life for the sake of this lie, that doesn't wash.
Somebody would have squealed.
Right. I mean, somebody's going to say, no, I'm done. You know, I value my life. I'm not going to give it for this.
Kind of related to that too, just the cowardice of the disciples. They were they're running at the first sight of people coming.
Yeah, and we're going to come back to that in a
But
minute.
they're gonna take down all the Roman soldiers and move a stone.
All right, and there's another huge issue.
are
The
you serious?
tomb has a seal on it, which is not a big deal. You can break that, just a piece of string with a wax. But what's the bigger deal? You got a Roman guard there. So you're going to say, okay, we've got 11 disciples who are fishermen in Galilee. We're going to take on a Roman garrison. Okay, sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay.
The argument that I've heard is that, maybe they were sleeping. And the argument I have against that is you still have a giant stone you have to get away. Even with 11 disciples,
It's a big, right.
I mean, it would only take one man to kind of throw it in, but to get it out.
You've got to roll it up the little track. These guys, the stones were in an inclined track. They were a round disc slab with a little groove cut for it. And so you would just knock loose the stone and it would just roll down into place and boom, that was it. It wasn't made to be opened again. Right, and it meant rolling it back up the hill. It was a big deal. Exactly right. So it was no small feat, and we wouldn't do it quietly or sneakily. That's right. So that's clearly the problem with this. So the stolen body just doesn't wash. And then we also have the whole problem of what was the mental state of the disciples? They had all run in fear, and when we finally do meet them again on Sunday, what are they doing? Hiding. And when the women come and say, hey, he's alive, what's their response? No, he's not. No, he's not. You're stupid women. Shut up. And even when Jesus appears, they still don't want to believe it. And when Thomas hears about it, he doesn't want to believe it. In fact, the disciples have to be forced to believe. They don't want to. So this idea that they're, concocting this just doesn't fit at all with what we know about them. All right, so that's going on. All right, so then we have another theory. And the next theory is the swooned theory. So how's this one go?
He wasn't really dead. Isn't that how this goes?
Yeah. He passed out on the cross, and so then they thought he was dead, so they took him down and they buried him, and in the cool of the tomb, he revived and got his strength back, and then made his way to the disciples and said, look, guys, I'm alive. I conquered death. And the disciples said, dude, that's so cool. And then later he succumbed to his wounds and he died, but hey, he resurrected. And then the story starts. That's the theory. So what's wrong with the theory?
How does he get out of this tomb?
Well, this is a huge issue. So he revives in the tomb, so now he's got the stone. How's he going to kick that open? Just kick it open from the inside? Man. All right, so that's a big problem. We have others.
Yeah, well, he was stabbed in the side by
The Roman guard stabs him in the side, and we have the blood and water flowing out, whatever that means. And everybody can have lots of theories on that, and don't go allegorizing it like everyone else does. But it's obviously, John probably meant it as something more, because John never did anything by accident. But the water and blood flow out, and there's the evidence, hey, he's killed. And the side pierce would have gone, most people would say, up underneath the rib cage into the visceral organs, heart, lungs, so you're not going to survive that. All right, good? Yeah, see, this is the thing. Romans were good at killing people. They were pretty good at doing crucifixions. And the idea of somebody surviving, yeah, it's not going to happen. Yeah.
Well, and a lot of this come up. This is kind of my rant on this. A lot of this swoon stuff came from Muslim tradition.
Yep.
And am I going to believe somebody 500 years after the fact or
Right.
an actual eyewitness account?
Exactly. All right. Good. Yep.
Just because the language didn't change.
Yeah, like how they buried him and tried to preserve him or whatever.
All right.
All the,
Yeah, and the text talks about
the
this.
process of that. Yeah.
80 pounds of spices for Gamaliel and more for Jesus. Wow. And, they would wrap them up. And if you got Joseph and Nicodemus spending this time with the body wrapping it up, do they know it's dead? Can they tell the difference between a dead body and one who is, one's cold or just kind of passed out? They knew. And they know what they're doing. So, and they're burying him and all the grave clothes and everything. Yeah, they know what's going on. So the Romans didn't mess up crucifying. They knew their business. They were quite successful in killing people, and they did it. And the guys burying him, Joseph and Nicodemus, would have known. And then you have the other problem of even if Jesus had survived and managed to revive himself and get the stone open. So then he's going to drag himself to the disciples and say, here I am, guys, your resurrected Messiah, looking like he would look after having gone through the crucifixion. Hardly impressive. And so it just doesn't wash on any level at all. Now, there are other theories. There's even the twin brother theory, that Jesus had a twin brother, and he was the one who made the appearance. You know, these things just become absurd, but that's one that gets around.
You can have two cribs in the nativity?
Yeah, right, yeah, for the twin brother. Yeah, Jesus and his twin brother, Jeremiah or whatever, yeah, or Hugo. Yeah, and so, yeah, it gets absurd. But these are the attempts. Now, the reason, yeah, right, yeah, I'm familiar with that. So, what's driving this? What's driving this is the problem of the empty tomb. Because if the tomb wasn't empty, then the Sanhedrin would have simply produced the body of Jesus. But the tomb was empty. And in fact, the changing the disciples is one of the strongest pieces of evidence for the overall facts. Because here you have these disciples who are basically losers, who just blow it again and again and again, all turn tail and run, refuse to believe the resurrection, and then, 50 days later, Pentecost, what are they doing? Yeah, Peter's in public declaring, that one that you crucified, God has made him Lord. And, you know, he is the judge. And suddenly people are repenting and the church is going gangbusters. And now these disciples are taking on the Sanhedrin and doing lashings and threatening with death and don't care and dying as martyrs. What's going on? What's with the transformation? Something big happened. And then there's another theory, hallucination. Mass hallucination. They all imagined that Jesus had risen. And as Meyer says, you know, if that was one person, maybe. But 12, you don't have mass hallucination, or 11 plus the others, and then you have multiple appearances of Jesus, not just the one time in the upper room, other times. So what's going on here? Hallucination doesn't cut it. It doesn't explain it. So what you're left with is the reality. These disciples with this huge change, an empty tomb that cannot be explained. And so the facts just start to pile up, and then you're left with saying, how do we account for this? Well, the obvious answer from the standpoint of Christian faith and apologetics is, the one best answer that accounts for all the evidence is, Jesus rose from the dead. But if you have ruled that out from the beginning, you can never consider that. And so that's really what's going on here. And the reason this exercise is useful is because people need to realize the evidence for the empty tomb and for the resurrection of Christ is compelling. It's not like we just have this little story that we're kind of clinging to. There's all kinds of evidence to support the fact of our faith. And yes, it is still an issue of faith, but it's not faith founded only on wishful thinking. It is faith founded on empirical evidence grounded in history. It happened. It happened. And that's kind of the upshot of all this. So Metaxas walks through this stuff, I think, pretty well, and covers a lot of this pretty well, and you get this nicely done, and it works. And that's the real advantage of this.